We live in an era of uncertainty, where life's meaning feels increasingly out of reach. Confronted with a universe that offers no answers to our questions, we face the absurd, the idea that, despite our desire for purpose, answers seem non-existent. Albert Camus, one of the great thinkers of the 20th century, proposed a bold solution: to accept the absurd and live fully, without being bound by emptiness. But there's an even more intriguing figure in this scene. The fool, with his lightheartedness and simplicity, lives spontaneously, ignoring the weight of conventions and laughing at the certainties that paralyze us. He shows us that perhaps the secret to a full life lies in embracing the unknown and laughing at the chaos. But how does this philosophy play out in practice? What role does the fool have in a meaningless world? Albert Camus was born on November 7, 1913, in Mondovi, Algeria, a French colony at the time. His life began with a tragic and somber note. Shortly after his birth, his father died in World War I, a loss that Camus' mother, mute and deaf, endured amid extreme poverty. This environment of deprivation, marked by solitude and scarcity, awakened in him a unique sensitivity and a deep understanding of human vulnerability. From an early age, Camus sought to understand the life around him, but felt trapped by the harshness of reality and its apparent lack of meaning. A dedicated student, he won a scholarship to the University of Algiers, where he devoted himself to philosophy, literature, and theater. But amidst this intellectual blossoming, a new adversity struck. Camus was diagnosed with tuberculosis. At the time, the disease was severe and incurable, forcing him to confront the fragility of his own existence in a profoundly personal way. The illness physically limited him, periodically interrupting his studies and requiring him to isolate in sanatoriums. This experience deepened his tragic perception of life and forced him to reflect on the meaning of existence at a very young age. This context of loss, suffering, and restriction imposed a relentless reflection on Camus about humanity's role in the universe, leading him to develop his vision of the absurd. To him, the absurd is the inevitable clash between the human desire to find a clear, rational meaning to life and the lack of any satisfying answer from the universe. In other words, life is an unsolvable riddle. Faced with this void, the most common reaction would be despair, but Camus proposes another alternative: to accept the absurd. He argues that it is possible to live fully without illusions, by creating a personal, conscious meaning, even though it is fleeting and devoid of absolute value. And it is here that we meet the figure of the fool, a character that appears repeatedly throughout history and literature. The fool is someone who, like Camus's absurd hero, lives without concern for conventions or social norms. He is an outsider, a figure who challenges rules and exposes human contradictions and frailties, often through laughter and lightheartedness. While the absurd hero faces the void with lucidity and courage, the fool does so with humor and carefree disregard, maintaining a perspective that is light and authentic. He does not bow to social pressures demanding efficiency, success, or seriousness. Instead, he reveals the futility of these expectations through a kind of intentional innocence. The fool is one of the oldest archetypes in human history, and his presence over time reveals much about how we grapple with life's absurdity. The earliest idea of the fool appears prominently in medieval and Renaissance literature, as in the archetypal court jesters, whose roles were, at first glance, merely for entertainment, but who were also allowed to speak truths others could not. The fools and clowns of European courts, for example, often mocked monarchs, nobles, and society, exposing their fallacies with humor and irreverence. They were frequently more in tune with the realities of common people than the rulers themselves, showing that laughter has the power to illuminate life's darkest and most contradictory aspects. In philosophy, the fool takes on a deeper resonance. The idea of someone who lives outside social conventions and challenges the seriousness of moral and existential norms can be seen, for example, in thinkers like Søren Kierkegaard and Friedrich Nietzsche. Kierkegaard, with his concept of the aesthetic man who surrenders to a life of pleasure and play, resembles the fool who, rather than seeking a greater meaning or moral sense for life, embraces freedom in the moment. Friedrich Nietzsche, with his philosophy of the overman and the death of God, embraced the idea that social conventions and traditional beliefs no longer offered real meaning. To Nietzsche, the fool could be a liberating figure, someone who, by rejecting conventional morality, could find his own truth and thus live more authentically. In his work, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he suggests that individuals should embrace their authenticity and courage, and perhaps the fool, who defies society's dogmas, embodies the model of the true overman, free from the limitations of inherited morality. Of course, Albert Camus also incorporates the idea of the fool in his philosophy of the absurd. For him, the fool is one of many ways to respond to life's absurdity. While the absurd hero accepts the lack of meaning consciously and courageously, the fool navigates this void more lightly, almost as if playing with existence's chaos. Camus' fool, like the absurd hero, doesn't seek a higher purpose but finds a way to live intensely in the moment, unburdened by heavy morality or a search for transcendent destiny. The fool, therefore, is a kind of spiritual sibling to the absurd hero. Both confront the world as it is, without needing to fill the void with illusions of meaning or future rewards. The absurd hero finds freedom in conscious acceptance of life's lack of meaning, while the fool finds freedom in an unconscious refusal to conform to these values. He lives in the moment, free from anxieties about the future or regrets about the past, and his lightness serves as a form of resistance against the demands of modern life, which often stifle spontaneity and authenticity. In his own journey, Camus found a way to express these ideas through theater and literature. In works like The Stranger and The Myth of Sisyphus, he personifies the absurd and the acceptance of the human condition. In Sisyphus, for example, we see a man condemned to roll a rock up a hill, only to watch it roll back down, repeatedly, eternally. But in Camus' view, Sisyphus is no defeated man. He is a hero who finds freedom in accepting his task and embracing the absurdity of his fate. Similarly, the fool also performs a kind of absurd work by unmasking society's seriousness and tensions with an almost childlike lightness. He reflects Camus' courage to accept the absurd, for while the world leans on fragile and illusory certainties, the fool moves forward in lightness, laughing at conventions and reminding us that, in the end, maybe everything is a grand joke. His philosophy is a direct response to emptiness, to the burden of meaning and mortality, showing that the true secret to a full life may be in laughing into the abyss and continuing forward, light, free, and at peace. Camus challenges us not to succumb to despair when confronted with the emptiness and indifference of the universe. In facing the absurd, the conflict between our desire for meaning and a world that offers no definitive answers, an alternative emerges. Instead of surrendering to anguish, we can forge our own path, defining our meaning autonomously and rejecting conformity with illusions. This creation of a personal meaning, without promises of future reward, demands a lucid and intense courage. For Camus, it is a rare and precious form of freedom, as it frees us from the need for a transcendental justification to live. Life then becomes a stage where we can truly be ourselves, without being prisoners of an endless search for a later that would validate the present. On the other hand, in a world so difficult and often hostile, the fool is able to maintain his lightness because he is not attached to rigid rules of rationality or the need for success and efficiency. He finds meaning in the present moment, in small joys and fleeting instances, showing that true freedom is breaking free from absolute control and allowing oneself to flow with circumstances, no matter how challenging they may be. A touching example of this philosophy appears in the film Life is Beautiful, where the character Guido, a father imprisoned with his son in a concentration camp, transforms the brutal reality around him into a game to protect his son's innocence. Even in the face of extreme suffering, Guido chooses lightness and playfulness as an antidote to cruelty, creating a competition that makes his son see the camp as an adventure. War, horror, and danger become, in the child's eyes, part of a clever game his father invented to make him happy. Guido embodies the fool's resilience as he refuses to let despair take over and instead builds a temporary, intimate sense of meaning filled with love and protection, even in the emptiness of war. Guido's stance, like that of the fool, reflects Camus' view on the absence of transcendental meaning. For Camus, a transcendental meaning is the pursuit of a definitive explanation that justifies our existence, something beyond earthly experience, a final answer that provides eternal comfort. He rejects this idea because, in accepting the absurd, we realize that the universe gives us no guarantee of a higher purpose. Instead, it invites us to create meaning here and now in our own actions and daily choices. The fool acts similarly. He does not seek a justification for living. He simply lives. And in living, he finds meaning in spontaneity and simplicity, in the freedom to embrace the moment without expecting a hidden truth to explain everything. Both the fool and Camus' absurd hero share a boldness in facing life. While the absurd hero faces the void with a sober stance, accepting the absurd with lucidity and courage, the fool responds with an almost intuitive lightness, laughing at conventions and dancing over the void. Both, however, refuse to yield to despair, each in their own way. The absurd hero does so by consciously embracing his freedom, forging his own path without depending on a predefined destiny. He is aware of his condition but refuses to be defeated by it. The fool, in turn, maintains a more playful, almost childlike outlook, navigating life with a smile and a carefree attitude that borders on the transcendental. Camus's response to the absurd is remarkably simple yet profoundly powerful. To live with intensity, fully acknowledging the absence of any final meaning. What he proposes is not a meek resignation, but a vibrant acceptance of our human condition, marked by uncertainty and finitude. Camus does not ask us to abandon our search for meaning. Rather, he suggests that instead of waiting for definitive answers from a seemingly indifferent universe, we should live in the now with the same intensity with which we seek to understand what cannot be understood. The fool goes even further in this radical acceptance of the present. The fool is not merely accepting the lack of meaning. He embraces it with an ironic smile, laughing at the conventions, norms, and social expectations that entrap us. He teaches us that living fully is not about accumulating certainties or controlling the future, but about freeing ourselves from the shackles society imposes and living with lightness and sincerity, as if to say, we don't need all this to be happy. The fool does not make demands of life. He receives it with the spontaneity of someone unburdened by heavy expectations. In a world that constantly teaches us to accumulate wealth, status, or external validation, the fool shows that true freedom can be found by letting go of these impositions. Living authentically, without masks, is what truly allows us to touch the essence of existence. Authenticity is not about pleasing others or meeting external standards, but about being true to who we are in the moment, without the distortions that social expectations often impose on us. The fool masters this. He does not strive to fit into the rules of the game and therefore reveals his true face. Contrary to what many might think, his lightness is not a sign of weakness or a lack of understanding. It is a radical form of sincerity. The fool does not pretend, does not try to be what he is not, and because of this, he paradoxically becomes a figure deeper than the world credits him for. It's important to remember that, unlike naivety, which involves a lack of perception of reality, the fool's innocence is a conscious choice not to be dominated by conventions and social expectations. Naivety, in this case, would be an attempt to escape reality or a failure to recognize the world's complexity. But the fool, as naive as his attitude may seem, is actually deeply aware of life's contradictions. He chooses not to entangle himself in them. The fool, then, is no fool at all. He is the wisest among us, for he lives free from the constraints of should be. Camus' philosophy, with its notion of the absurd, already questions the certainties imposed by society, but it is the fool who takes this questioning even further. He is, by definition, the character who defies conventions and dogmas that, for so long, have imprisoned humanity. While society demands seriousness, efficiency, and conformity, the fool smiles in the face of these expectations, showing that by clinging to them, we lose the ability to live with spontaneity and authenticity. Social conventions, in their rigidity, create an automated life where individuals become cogs in a system that stifles individual reflection. People become so focused on following rules of success, morality, productivity, that they forget to ask if those rules truly make sense to them. This imposition of seriousness and conformity is one of the greatest prisons of modern life. The should be is often stronger than the I am. What we often see are entire lives spent trying to fit into what is expected, without ever questioning whether it truly aligns with their own desires and essence. The risk is that, by trying to control every aspect of life, by constantly seeking validation, people drift away from what is spontaneous and genuine. Life becomes a race toward external goals, but loses its deeper meaning, the freedom to live the present with awareness and authenticity. Philosophers like Nietzsche, for instance, criticize traditional morality, which he argues inhibits the development of authentic individuality. For him, the morality imposed by society and religion creates a herd of conforming individuals who live by external values without questioning their own will to live. Traditional morality, in his view, represses the individual and keeps them confined within a system that does not encourage their freedom. If conventional morality teaches us to be controlled and predictable, then perhaps the path to true freedom is the opposite, the acceptance of our imperfection, the ability to laugh at ourselves and our limitations without losing sight of the fact that, in the end, we are all fools, doing our best to find meaning in a world that offers no ready answers. Accepting what we cannot understand in practice means stopping the fight against the flow of life. It means recognizing that some things simply have no explanation, and that in trying to find meaning in every small part of human experience, we might lose the joy of living in the present. This doesn't mean we should be passive or resigned, but that we should learn to let go of the obsession for ready-made answers. Accepting the absurd, as Camus suggests, is embracing that we are neither masters of the universe nor even of our own lives. Yet we can still make something meaningful out of them. But accepting this lightness and emptiness requires courage. Courage to live without the social masks that shape appearances and impose norms. Courage to shed what is imposed on us: success, conventional morality, or the idea of a transcendent purpose. Living without masks is a hard task in a world that values appearances so highly. Often, society rejects us when we show ourselves as too authentic. The truth, however, is that true freedom only exists when we can be who we really are, without the pressure to conform to what others expect of us. And the fool, in his apparent naivety, teaches us exactly this, that living authentically, with all our imperfections and contradictions, is the greatest form of resistance we can offer to a world that demands we be too serious. It's not about living a life without responsibilities or without awareness of the consequences of our actions. Rather, it's about living with a radical sincerity, where lightness is not an escape from reality, but a way to engage with it fully. The philosophy of the fool, with its proposal to live authentically amid existential emptiness, remains a vital response to our times. In a world saturated with the search for meaning, ready-made answers, and empty promises, the fool teaches us a simple yet revolutionary truth. Freedom does not lie in finding explanations, but in living unbound by the expectation that we must understand everything. Living authentically then becomes both a resistance to emptiness and an acceptance of it. The fool doesn't deny existential emptiness, but faces it with a smile, as if to say, yes, life may not make sense, but it's wonderful just as it is. Existential emptiness, far from being an obstacle, becomes fertile ground for freedom. When we no longer feel compelled to fill this emptiness with things or answers, we can finally focus on what truly matters: the present. Living in the now, without fear of the future or regret for the past, is the greatest gift we can give ourselves. The fool, by laughing at the absurd and living authentically, shows us that perhaps the secret to a fulfilled life lies in embracing the emptiness, not as a burden, but as an opportunity to live with more truth, humor, and lightness. Thus, as we face the abyss of existence, the fool challenges us not to hesitate, not to fear the void, but to accept it as part of our human condition. He teaches us that ultimately, living authentically is not about finding a final meaning, but about being true to ourselves moment by moment, with courage and without masks. The abyss may be daunting, but with a smile and a laugh that defies conventions and expectations, it becomes a blank canvas on which to create a truly free life.